Okay, this is a big swing from the Vatican today. Pope Leo dropped his first encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas, and it's a full-on warning label for the AI age. Leo isn't just saying, be ethical. He's calling for real rules, robust regulation, independent oversight, and he's taking a shot at the culture of power and profit driving the AI race. He's also warning AI is turbocharging disinformation and reshaping work. And he draws a hard line in the sand on warfare. He says it's not permissible to hand irreversible, lethal decisions to machines. And he demands accountability all the way up and down the chain, from the people who build the systems to the people who deploy them. The timing is wild too. The Vatican launches this with Christopher Olah, that's the co-founder of Anthropic, the AI company currently suing the Trump administration after the US ordered federal agencies to stop using its tech. The bottom line is a global power question. Who controls AI? Who cashes in? And what's simply off limits? Lots to unpack here with our two experts. We'll have a proper friar and podcaster, the podcast's name Godsplaining, in a moment for some background. But first, we're talking to Alina Trabettoni. She's a journalist in Rome and covered today's events. Alina, what happened at the Vatican today, and why is this launch itself unusual?
Well, in fact, as you say, it's very hard not to overstate how unusual this encyclical is, and the presentation of the encyclical, of course, because everyone I've spoken to on the ground in the Vatican, we're talking pilgrims, experts, Catholics, Vatican analysts, they simply repeat this because it's the underlying context this encyclical has been rolled out in. Very, very, very unusual. A papal encyclical, in fact, normally lands as a document. It's released online. It's presented by a few cardinals. And, the Pope generally stays out of it. He's not on the front line. But this morning, Pope Leo completely broke the mold. He came in person to the new Synod Hall to present this new encyclical, his first encyclical, with Cardinal Parolin standing, speaking right beside him. And, he gave an address and, of course, a blessing that was very much followed, and something popes simply don't do for, a social encyclical. And that alone tells you how much weight Pope Leo is putting behind this document, this encyclical. And the second unusual thing, which you mentioned as well, is who was sitting at the table besides the cardinal, besides Cardinal Fernandez, Cardinal Cerny, and the theologians that were present. As we know, the Vatican put a Silicon Valley figure on the table, on the panel, Christopher Olah, who's co-founder of AI company Anthropic, who researches how these systems actually work on the inside. And Olah's own line, of course, before these questions, the AI raises are bigger than the AI community, than the whole world, than religion, civil society, governments. And a tech founder helping to present a papal encyclical is a deliberate signal. The Vatican wants to be inside the AI conversation, not lecturing it from outside.
Now, so as we heard, the Vatican invited the Anthropic co-founder Christopher Olah to the launch, while the encyclical criticizes concentrated private power and calls for external regulation. How does that go together?
Well, it's a very good question, I would say. In fact, his presence, it created, it highlighted the internal tension between the various topics and themes within the encyclical. And of course, it cut both ways. His presence cut both ways. And there were some faith and technology voices, analysts, experts that openly questioned the optics of giving an AI founder the stage. But, it didn't stop there. The tension internal to the encyclical didn't stop there. The symbolism within it is very layered as well. Pope Leo signed it on the 15th of May, which is the 135th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII, 1891 encyclical on workers and the Industrial Revolution. So that's very, very important to bear in mind as well. Just as the church spoke to the machine age back then, Leo means to speak to the AI age now. And he's put a big protagonist on the panel with everyone present. And, you know, it's a big document, 43,000 words, 5 chapters. And it's very much, despite this internal tension and despite all the questions it's raising, it's been staged as a landmark. And it feels like one, according to the people on the ground.
Now, the Pope in it calls for robust legal frameworks and independent oversight, not just ethics promises. The Pope can't regulate himself. Who can, and what's the question here?
Well, that's a very, very good question, in fact. You know, and this is one example of where the encyclical gets very, very concrete. You know, it doesn't just, you know, hedge what it says in terms of religious context and doctrine. You know, it gets very, very concrete. As you say, he calls for very robust legal frameworks, independent oversight and informed users. And of course, the line traveling around the world today for politics, he says, for politics that's, and you know, this is direct quotation, I'm going by memory, that's capable of slowing things down when everything's accelerating. So in effect, to all accounts, he's basically openly urging the AI companies to cool down their competition. So yes, in a sense, a lot of people are seeing it as a challenge to big tech, but also a very, very precise, concrete one. He's not saying stop building. He's saying you've got to set the moral terms for everyone. You cannot set the moral terms for everyone behind closed doors. And remember, again, that there's the optics. He's saying this when an AI company's co-founder, one of the biggest co-founders, is sitting right there besides him.
He also spoke on the topic of warfare. He draws a bright red line there. Lethal decisions can't be automated, and the chain of accountability must run back through designers and commanders. How will he achieve that? How can that be achieved?
Well, yes, it's a very moral statement. It's also being considered a policy demand. Many say that it's both. It's a combination of both. He lays out 3 criteria here, and basically what he calls non-negotiable requirements. And at the end of this, if you boil down to the basics here, the moral core is very, very stark. He's saying moral judgment can't be reduced to calculation. So it's, and this is his words, it's not permissible to entrust lethal or otherwise irreversible war decisions to artificial systems. War decisions to artificial systems, AI, and so forth. And one of the sharpest points he made was that no algorithm can make war morally acceptable. He then, also warns that AI doesn't remove the inhumanity of war. It just makes it perhaps be considered, faster and more impersonal, turning victims into data and, basically, justifying perhaps the lowering of the threshold for using force, which he very, very much pushes against it. But again, he doesn't stop at the principle there. He turns it into demands. He makes it very concrete. There are demands you literally, you can lift off the pages. And one is that the chain of responsibility in these situations must be identifiable and verifiable. And everyone who designs, trains, authorizes and deploys these types of systems has to be accountable. You can't just let the blame collapse into the machine or, the AI algorithm. And the second thing, of course, is that the decision to use lethal force, he says, must stay under, in his own words, he says something like effective, self-aware, basically human control. And that's very, very important to bear in mind. And of course, his third point, of course, is that there has to be a shared international framework to curb the arms race and protect civilians. So it reads like moral teaching written in the grammar of policy. It's very, very beautifully written. Meaningful human control is called for, traceability, accountability across the whole chain.
But if we're talking about enforcement, how does the Pope plans to push this? Can he use what, the UN, G7, bilateral diplomacy? What can the Catholic Church do?
Well, that's a difficult one because, of course, the Pope Leo is a religious leader, well, he is considered a political leader, but of course, there's limited range of direct action he can take, if any. He's got a huge amount of moral suasion as the leader of the Catholic Church, of course. Because, such a large portion of the world's population is Catholic. And he's very much like his predecessors. I mean, we all remember Pope Francis and all his involvement in trying to broker peace with the Ukraine war. And Pope Leo as well is very much on the forefront. And, he has made his thoughts very, very clear in terms of the Middle Eastern crisis. So I think it will boil down to moral suasion. But, if anyone has the sort of clout and power that Pope Leo does, then, it could be put to good effect.
Thank you very much. Alina Trabatoni, there, journalist in Rome. Thank you for your reporting. And we're now joined also from Rome by Reverend Father Patrick Mary Briscoe. He's a Dominican friar and author, and also the Promoter General for Social Communication for the Order of Preachers. He is also the host of a podcast with a fantastic title, Godsplaining. I really love that one. Father Patrick, let's delve right into some Pope-splaining, shall we? First, tell us, what is an encyclical and what does it mean that the Pope chooses this encyclical to talk about AI?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. An encyclical letter is a keystone document. It's a letter essentially addressed to the church and to all people of goodwill. Popes have written them for centuries, picking up on various issues and challenges of the day. For Pope Leo XIV, he's signaling by having signed Magnificat Humanitas on the 135th anniversary of another encyclical letter, he's picking up on the great challenge of our day, the revolution of AI. It's an amazing thing that he's chosen this topic because artificial intelligence, as we know, isn't just one technological development among many. It's a revolution. It's a total transformation of not just the tech industry, but of our whole society. I think it's not only the question to say, well, why would the Pope be talking about AI? The question really should be, why wouldn't the Pope be talking about AI? It would be criminal were he to avoid the question.
Now, the other encyclical that you talked about that was published 135 years ago, that was also about a very worldly affair, right?
Indeed, exactly. Rerum Novarum, this encyclical letter written by Pope Leo XIII, who is something of an inspiration for Pope Leo XIV. Rerum Novarum addressed all of the changes of the Industrial Revolution. We can put our minds back in the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, and we can think of the mass transformation brought about by all the advancement of industrial technologies. That brought about a radical transformation of society. Pope Leo XIII, 135 years ago, had to address all the injustices that new technology was bringing to the world. For example, capital, which was held in the hands of a few, and all of the abuses that were being taken against workers and of the poor. Pope Leo XIV is seeing some of those same themes at play today and is bringing them up again in this new encyclical letter, Magnificat Humanitas.
It's hard not to see the connection there. The Pope calls AI the biggest challenge facing humanity today from a church perspective. What makes AI different from other technologies we've adapted to?
Well, what the Holy Father says in this encyclical letter that I think is so profound is that AI really could cause us to lose our own humanity. It's an extraordinary thing. We risk losing responsibility. We risk losing agency. We risk losing moral reflection. We risk losing all the things that make us human, all the things that make humanity what we are, for better and for worse. And all of that is threatened by the superimposition of a radical new technology, especially that which artificial intelligence brings. And so what the Pope is calling for in this letter is that we be reflective, that we be responsible about the technology. I think this is interesting for a lot of people because the Vatican is not anti-technology. The Pope is not against artificial intelligence. That would be a tremendous misreading. What the Pope is insisting, however, is that we think very intentionally about what these technologies mean and how we're using them in our lives, because again, there's such potential for them to subvert all of those things that make humanity great.
Now, he warns about a culture of power driving the AI race. But what does that mean, and why is the Church so concerned about power concentrating in a few hands? Because the Catholic Church has been accused of misusing power in the past as well.
The Holy Father is so concerned, I think, because we see with the increasing geopolitical tensions that transnational authority being taken up by just a few tech companies would risk every major lesson that's been learned, not only by the Church, but by all of humanity in the last 100 years. When we think back to the wars and the conflicts that we've seen in recent years, we know that we need something more than just one institution. And the Pope's claim, which is actually very, very humble, he apologizes for wrongdoings on the Church's part in the past, in fact, in the document. The Pope's really setting off a warning sign, not insisting that the Church be the one head. The Church isn't here going to supplant the state. The Church isn't here going to become a great Silicon Valley tech company. We know all of us know that's true. But the Church is really calling for a shared work. And that's what was so interesting about Chrysola being present today from Anthropic on the scene, because what's clear is that a real dialogue is needed, a conversation of partners that cuts across disciplines, that cuts across institutions, that cuts across different kinds of authority, so that it's not simply a government, it's not simply capital from major investors, it's not simply new tech companies, it's not simply computer scientists, it's not simply one body, but that everyone working together and having a shared conversation can advance the common good of humanity.
Now, with the Anthropic co-founder there on the podium with him, he also says in the encyclica that we need accountability across the whole chain, that from designers to commanders who may use AI for warfare. Why does the Church insist responsibility cannot be outsourced to a machine?
What's interesting about this is that it's clear that in these dialogues there are going to be disagreements. So Mr. Ola has been clear in some of these conversations, and so has the Pope. For example, in his calls for regulation, in his calls arguing that data belongs to the common good that must be protected. All of this is a difficult message for some to take. But by calling for transparency for algorithms, in particular, the Holy Father is calling for something that can really help to build up the common good of everyone. Because that kind of transparency, as the Church has learned again in very painful ways in recent years, that kind of transparency lends credibility. It builds trust. I think that's one of the greatest threats that the Holy Father was arguing. He's bringing about, for example, in the encyclical, a major conversation about the nature of truth, which is being challenged today. He says very clearly that the Church doesn't have a monopoly on it. We believe in certain unchanging truths revealed to us by God. That's true, but the Catholic Church is not the only one with something to say today. A very beautiful moment in the encyclical. But he calls for an open conversation about truth, because when we lose sight of reality, and this is the point about agency that you're asking, when we lose sight of reality, when we become completely detached from things as they are, we risk deeply injuring human society.
Now, one effect of the growing importance of AI that many of our viewers can feel very soon, or are maybe already feeling, is is how the workplace is influenced by this, how jobs will be lost. And the Pope says profit cannot justify systematically sacrificing work because, quote, the human person is an end, not a means. What would that principle demand in the real world for CEOs, for lawmakers, politicians, and workers?
Part of the answer, and this is why the anniversary of the previous document that we were discussing is so important, part of the answer from the perspective of the church is to look back to the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. We know that jobs are going to be transformed. They're already being transformed. Some positions are being eliminated as they are. And what the church is calling for is a recognition of the dignity of every human person, of the value that work has in our lives. Employers and governments have a responsibility to make sure that people can be retrained. With the investment of AI, with the implementation of AI in the workplace, jobs are going to change. Not every job is going to be eliminated. New jobs are beginning because a new sector is being opened. So what the Pope is calling for precisely, particularly, again, is not that we abandon the use of AI, it would be impossible, but that employers and governments are attentive to the needs of a workforce which is going to change rapidly and dramatically because of the invention of this new technology. The same sort of thing happened to workers 135 years ago.
Now, one other issue, and I do not know whether it's being addressed in the encyclica, is the fact that many people already are using AI agents to talk to us, if to friends or to priests, to look for advice for life. Is that something that the Pope is concerned about? And does it also touch the question of self-awareness of AI and AI having a soul?
Absolutely. The Holy Father is very clear. AI is not a human person. We know that these technologies mimic humanity, mimic human qualities, mimic our thought patterns. In fact, in Mr. Ola's comments, he talked about the dramatic way that AI is now grown in ways that are surprising, ways that surprise even developers. But it's clear, of course, that a machine doesn't have the capacity that a human person has to love. So from the church's perspective, what ought to be considered really is our embodiment and the nature of relationship. This came out in the remarks today at the Vatican during the release of the document, in some of the Holy Father's remarks directly, but in other contributors there today, the importance of relationality. We've seen already great tragedies, an increase in suicidality, for example, in people that try and replace relationships with other human persons, with other human beings, with these technologies. This is one of the grave threats. It's something the Church is very concerned about and is very clear about the risks of in the document. Pope Leo calls, for example, for protections for children, for attention for how we introduce our young people to this technology, warning against unsupervised uses of these technologies.
Now, Father Patrick, as a daily practitioner on the front lines, what's one practical habit you tell viewers to adopt with AI at work, in school, and also in politics, maybe?
In fact, the Pope gives us a number of different practical things we can do. I think the first, as the Holy Father insists, the first is to not let the machine think for us. The machine is a research tool, and it can aid us greatly with aspects of our project, like translation. It can help guide and generate ideas, but ultimately it can't produce them fundamentally the way that a human being can. So what would do us well, I think, is to become people more attentive to philosophy. This is part of what Mr. Olaf referenced. Our love for the humanities ultimately is going to save us here. And so we have to be wary of how much time we're spending on these technologies. And again, the practical proposal here is to step back from them. I know this sounds a little silly, but open a book and read a novel every night and reclaim your humanity.
That's very sound advice there from Father Patrick Briscoe there. Thank you very much for sharing your insights.
My joy.
With
Thank you
us.
for having me.
And that's it from us for today. Hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.